In this commentary, we're going to be responding to HelloGreedo in a recent book published by Lucasfilm. Now, let me provide a little bit more context for those who are completely unaware. HelloGreedo is a YouTuber who's very critical of the prequels, but he's very much into the sequel trilogy. But I don't want to make it seem like this is just me going to be praising HelloGreedo, because as Star Wars only has commented, it seems that HelloGreedo is not very tolerant towards dissenting opinion. Now, I don't think we're going to see that manifested in what we're going to respond to, but I do want to point out, I'm going to add some additional details which I think complicate the picture. But the video here will be generally pro TLJ, because I think there's, again, a lot of factual material that backs up that stance. So we're going to listen to HelloGreedo and then respond to this new book.
Came Kira, then Echo, and finally Rey. Close quote. There's no question that what we got was probably, definitely, way different than what George's original treatments were like, right? Things change, it's not surprising. The franchise literally changed hands. There's no question that most of George's big and small ideas were changed or outright thrown aside. But it's also safe to say that some of his ideas did show up. There's no question that some of his ideas were adopted to what would ultimately become the sequel trilogy. And what's really interesting to me is that it seems like the idea that has caused the most controversy or anger or whatever you want to call it among fans was actually George's idea. Luke Skywalker, a recluse, lost, Colonel Kurtz, in despair, haunted by a student who betrayed him, in self-imposed isolation. This was George Lucas's idea. And since my first review of The Last Jedi in 2017, I have expressed how much I loved the way Luke Skywalker was presented in that movie. And it was Lucas's idea, and we've known that for a few years now. So the narrative that's been dripping like a diarrhea asshole over the past few years that this guy somehow assassinated the character of Luke Skywalker is dumb and false. We've known this for a few years. I mean, this is a great example of somebody just being a punching bag for a bunch of people who didn't like a thing. I mean, it's blatant.
But Lucas would have done it different.
Cool, man. Cool. Just keep kicking that can down the road. You've created a little impenetrable, unwavering...
All right, we've heard Greedo speak. Now let's respond to it. Now, there's really one thing that's very old, but two things I think I'll add that are sort of new that we didn't previously know. The one thing, and I'll go through this very briefly because I'm sure some people have seen some of the videos I've done, so I've already covered this extensively. But essentially that in Lucas's original version of his idea for the sequel trilogy, Luke was going to be a bitter old Jedi who had become disillusioned with the Jedi Order, and so on and so forth. And even his own visual images, and we have concept art for it, was actually a little bit more radical than even Rian Johnson. I mean, Luke essentially was Kurtz Walker, which is named after this very ambiguous protagonist in Apocalypse Now. So what Greedo is covering essentially is now just the official use of those story treatments and giving us a little bit more information about Rey, for instance, that she had different names. They were conceptualizing her differently. The story was a little bit different because it wasn't Kylo Ren. There was a Jedi killer, and so on and so forth. But in broad outlines, basically what we saw in Last Jedi was actually a lot in Lucas's original vision. But now let me add a few things that he misses, and I think we want to contextualize a little carefully. So the basic stance, he says, is correct. People who sort of made this into Ryan did a character assassination are just simply wrong. I mean, factually wrong. There just is no basis for this myth. So I understand that Mark himself did not like a lot what happened in The Last Jedi, and that's fine, and you can invoke that. But to say that Lucas didn't like what happened in The Last Jedi is more problematic because substantively, they're pretty much the same. But HelloGreedo doesn't emphasize certain things. One is that the Apocalypse Now connection, such as it were, goes back a long time, right? Coppola is basically Lucas's mentor for a long time. They knew each other in California, and in fact, Lucas was actually originally slated to work on Apocalypse Now, so there's a actually deeper connection. And if you've seen some of my other videos, he's also references Coppola's Dracula and Godfather. So there's a much deeper genetic connection that Greedo seems to be aware of. So I'm going to correct him a little bit on that. But I think the more problematic thing, and this is what some people, and again, to his credit, Star Wars Only doesn't do this, but some of the people who tried to dismiss this have just sort of said, well, we can't trust Hidalgo. And I'm going to go halfway with them, because Hidalgo, who was part of the story group at Lucasfilm, is sort of a very, very mixed record. I think more recently his work has not been very good. If you look at the visual dictionary for Rise of Skywalker, it was overpriced and very, very poor. It gave a lot of contradictory information on Sidious's return. And sometimes Hidalgo has approved things that I think are fairly absurd, such as the super large Death Star and The Force Awakens. So his record in terms of the canon is, I think, a little mixed, and I think we want to be clear on that. So he's not a pure source, and we have to be aware of that. So his record is mixed, but in terms of the factual material, I don't think there's much to improve upon, what HelloGreedo said. This is basically what Lucas wanted. He wanted a much more disillusioned Luke, and he was going to be killed off. The timing is a little differently. Lucas was going to wait until episode 9 instead of episode 8. But again, in the big broad strokes, these are very, very similar stories. So we can grant the argument that Lucas would have done it differently. But again, for somebody on the pro TLJ side, I think Greedo was actually pretty modest, because this has been known among them for a very long time, but the rest of the Star Wars fandom has sort of been either in denial or just misrepresenting what happened. There's, of course, still a lot to disagree with. You can still dislike The Last Jedi. You can still dislike Rian Johnson. You can even dislike what he did with those story treatments. But to say that they ignored it completely, or they had no plan, etc., these are just myths that people have propagated for money. And I understand that, on YouTube you gotta do stuff to try to get attention to yourself, but there's really no factual basis for it. So it's gonna be getting more into really narrow interpretations of, well, how much did they follow story treatments, when did they do certain things, and things like that. But I think in the broad strokes, the TLJ side has been vindicated, at least in terms of Luke. I mean, we could argue about Rey and a few other things. They were changed a little bit more dramatically, but Rey was only supposed to have sort of a more co-equal status with a male Jedi, and they made her much more prominent, and we'll get into that. But in terms of the basic picture we got in TLJ, this seems to be what Lucas would have wanted. So it'll be interesting how others will try to respond to it. But in terms of the factual material, the TLJ side now has, I think, the upper hand. But we'll see how the other Star Wars fans react. Alright, this has been Star Wars Analyzed on Greedo and new revelations on Lucas's original plans for the sequel trilogy. Alright, thanks for listening. If you can, please comment below. Please hit a like. Please consider supporting the work on Patreon. Thank you. Have a good day.